Can run on for a long time. Run on for a long time. Run on for a
Thank you.
long time.
Thank you. Appreciate it. My name is Jocko, and I'm going to talk to you today about combat leadership, about the lessons that we learned on the battlefield and how you can take those lessons, and I think you're going to see how you can apply them not only to your business, but really to your life as well. So yes, I was in the SEAL teams. Now, a lot of times when people hear about the SEAL teams, what they think of is what they see on TV with that training that you see on TV where people are carrying boats on their heads and carrying logs around, and that is definitely part of the SEAL training. The whole time you're going through it, there's this bell that you can ring, and if you ring that bell, it means that you quit and you're no longer in the program. Of course, I didn't quit. I made it through the program, and I got to SEAL Team 1 in 1991. When I got there, the first Gulf War had just ended. And what that meant was that I was at a SEAL team, and there was no war going on. So what do you do when you're at a SEAL team and there's no war going on? Well, what you do is you train, and then you train some more, and then you train some more, and then you train some more. You do a lot of training. And I don't want to make the training sound that bad, because the training that you're doing is shooting machine guns, blowing things up, jumping out of airplanes. It's pretty much awesome. And then when we would go on deployment, we would help other foreign countries learn these skills that we had, but we still weren't fighting. And eventually, I got picked up for a commissioning program, which meant I was going to move into a leadership position. And when I did that, I went from SEAL Team 1, which is in San Diego, California, out to SEAL Team 2, which is over in Virginia Beach. And when I got to SEAL Team 2, that's where I did my first real missions as a SEAL. So what we were doing was there was sanctions against Iraq at the time, and they weren't allowed to buy or sell anything, so you had a bunch of smugglers smuggling stuff in and out of Iraq, mostly on the waterways, and somebody had to put a stop to that, and that somebody was us. And so what we would do is we would take down these vessels, and sometimes we'd take down big vessels like you see on the bottom left there, big oil tankers, and we'd get control of those vessels, and we would secure them, and then we'd turn them over to the authorities, and there'd be millions of dollars worth of fuel on there, so we'd feel pretty good about that. But most of the time we were taking down smaller vessels like you see on the bottom right there. They're called dhows. They're really common over in the Persian Gulf, and since they were a little bit smaller, we'd use our own boats to pull alongside, and we'd hook ladders on, and we'd climb up onto the boats like pirates, and we'd storm the bridge, and we'd get control, and then we'd search the cargo, and 99% of the time what they were carrying in the cargo was dates. Yeah. You know what dates are? They're like basically big giant raisins. So that was our mission, was to go out there and capture these giant raisins. Not exactly what I joined the SEAL teams to do, but that was our mission. And so we did it to the best of our ability. When I got done with those deployments out there, the Navy said I had to go to college. So they sent me back to San Diego. And when I got back to San Diego, my whole job was just to go to school. So I was getting my full Navy pay. My only job was to go to school. I was basically the highest paid college freshman of all time. And what I did was bought a house down by the beach, hung out with my family, went to school, and was really enjoying everything that San Diego and California, and really actually just enjoying everything that America has to offer. And it was an awesome time. And then this happened. So September 11th comes, our country is attacked, there's thousands of innocent Americans dead, and there's fear, and there's terror, and there's uncertainty throughout the country, except for really with me and my friends and folks in the military, and we were now very certain of one thing, and that is that we knew we were going to war. And the war kicked off in Afghanistan and very quickly shifted focus over to Iraq. And I thought that war was going to end very quickly, but luckily in the fall of 2003, I ended up deploying to Iraq as a SEAL platoon commander. And what that meant, what we were doing, was what we called direct action or capture kill missions. And what this is we would gather intelligence on the location of a bad guy. Once we knew where the bad guy was, we would load up our vehicles in the middle of the night. We would drive to the general vicinity where the bad guy was. We'd dismount the vehicles. We'd foot patrol the last little distance to get to the enemy target. Once we were there, just about every building in Iraq has like a 6 to 8 foot wall around it. So we had built little ladders. We'd put these ladders up against the wall. We'd climb over the wall. We'd get inside the compound. We'd put a big giant explosive breaching charge on the door. And then we'd step back, we'd blast the door open, we'd get inside the building, we'd clear the building, we'd capture the bad guys, we'd bring them back to base, we'd interrogate the bad guys, we would find out where their friends were, and then we'd go get their friends. And it was awesome. It was awesome. And I'm not some crazy war hawk, I'm not a psychopath, but that's what we had trained to do our whole life. And there was bad guys out there, and we had trained to go get them. It was a mission we were good at. And the bad guys at this time, they weren't very organized. They were a bunch of thugs running around, former criminals. And so we had a big advantage over them, a big tactical advantage over them. And we got in 4 or 5 firefights. I had one guy get wounded, wasn't really bad. So we kind of felt like rock stars. And we got done with this deployment. We kind of high-fived, and we came back to America. And we got back to America thinking that we had basically won the war ourselves. And we paid attention to what was happening in Iraq, and we very quickly found out that we were wrong because things in Iraq didn't get better. In fact, things in Iraq started getting worse. And we started hearing a new word to describe what was happening in Iraq, and the new word that we heard was insurgency. And what this meant was that these former regime elements, these former criminals and thugs that had been running around, well, now they were being led. There was finance coming in, there was Al-Qaeda leadership coming in to direct operations, and things started getting much, much worse in Iraq. And so now, what did America do? As things started to get worse in Iraq, what did we do as Americans? How do we change our strategy? Well, the answer initially is we didn't change our strategy at all. We kept doing the same thing, despite it was obvious that it wasn't working. Iraq was getting worse, but we kept doing the same thing, which is go out, grab a bad guy, bring him back to base, go out the next night, grab another bad guy, and bring him back to base. And we thought if we captured all the leaders of the bad guys, then they wouldn't be functional anymore. But we were wrong, and it wasn't turning out that way. It turned out like a snake. When you cut the head off of a snake, the snake dies, and that's what we thought would happen. If we killed the leadership or captured the leadership, then that snake would die. But this wasn't one singular snake. It was looked more like Medusa's head with snakes everywhere. And so things continued to get worse, and the more we stayed on these big bases that we had built throughout Iraq, the more aggressive and the more bold the enemy got. And eventually, the enemy started to take real estate. And nowhere was this more obvious than in a city in Al-Anbar province, western Iraq, the capital of Al-Anbar province, a city called Ramadi. And if you remember this time frame, now we're talking 2005, 2006, during this time frame, they were saying, if you watch the news during this time frame, they were saying every night that there was 2 soldiers killed in Al-Anbar province, or 4 soldiers or Marines killed in Al-Anbar province. And the vast majority of these casualties came from this capital city of Ramadi. The situation in Ramadi was actually so bad that a military intelligence report got leaked to the press, and it painted a grim picture of what was going on in Ramadi. And there was one of those quotes from that report that said that the social and political situation has deteriorated to a point that U.S. and Iraqi troops are no longer capable of militarily defeating the insurgency in Al-Anbar. No longer capable. And this report went on to say that both Ramadi and Al-Anbar province were all but lost. Now, when I had come back from my first deployment to Iraq, where I was in charge of 1 SEAL platoon, on my next deployment, when I came home, I got put in charge of 2 SEAL platoons. 2 SEAL platoons combined together is called a task unit, and my task unit was called Task Unit BRUISER. And we found out about 2 weeks before we went on deployment that we were deploying into the belly of the beast, into the city of Ramadi. Now, when we got there, there was actually a National Guard unit on the ground. If you don't know what that is, that's a unit made up of reservists, military reservists. They're not full-time soldiers, they're part-time soldiers. But when we got there to Ramadi, these part-time soldiers had been on the ground fighting for 14 months. And these part-time soldiers had become hardened combat warriors. And what they'd done is pretty much gotten control over the outskirts of the city. But the central part of Ramadi was almost completely controlled by the enemy, as you can see in those areas that are shaded in red. Now, just after we showed up, it was time for that National Guard unit to go home, and a new group came in to take their place. And the group that came in to take their place was called the 11 AD. And AD stands for Armored Division, and armor means that they had tanks. And if you don't know anything about tanks, well, there's a picture of one right there. And just to give you some context around that, the car that you drive probably weighs 2 or 3 tons. That tank right there weighs 68 tons. It is just a massive metal machine of total destruction, and is actually what I think one of the most beautiful creations that mankind has ever invented. And the reason that I think that is because when my guys were under the threat of being overrun in the city of Ramadi, it was these tanks and the soldiers and Marines that drove these tanks that came to my guys' rescue over and over again. Now, the reason I have the word "we" written up there is because I want to make it perfectly clear that when I talk about what we did over there, when I say we did this and we did that and we did something else, I want to make it crystal clear that I am absolutely not just talking about the 40 SEALs that I had with me. We're talking about this entire brigade of 5,600 soldiers and Marines, and they did the bulk of the heavy fighting, and they did the bulk of the heavy lifting, and we were humbled and honored to be able to support them. Now, the other thing that the 11 AD brought besides tanks was they brought a new strategy, a different strategy. And they called it seize, clear, hold, and build. And what this meant was we were going to go into these enemy-controlled territories. And instead of grabbing one bad guy and coming back, we were going to go into these enemy-controlled neighborhoods and stay there. So seize means you take some buildings, clear means you make sure there's no bad guys in them, hold means that you're going to stay, and then the last one is build, which means a construction project. You have to run a big construction project in these buildings that you take to fortify these buildings against enemy attacks, because when you put what we ended up calling a combat outpost in the middle of enemy-controlled territory, they are absolutely going to attack you. So you have to build these structures to be able to withstand those attacks. So it turns out being pretty much a construction project in a combat zone. Now, I wasn't sure what we as SEALs were going to be able to do to support this because we weren't construction guys, but I knew that when they were building these combat outposts, they were going to be very vulnerable to enemy attacks. So I figured that the best thing that we could do was set up positions 200 or 300 or 400 meters away from these combat outposts as they were being built, and then when the enemy maneuvered in to attack the combat outposts, we would be in clandestine positions that we called sniper overwatch, and we would interdict and we would eliminate the enemy. So these are just some images of what this looked like. The bottom left is night vision. The bottom right is one of those construction projects taking place. The top right is what it looked like in an overwatch position. And this is what it looked like over time. So again, the areas that are shaded in red are areas that are almost completely controlled by the enemy. And there's one road running down the middle of Ramadi called Route Michigan. It was statistically the most heavily IED'd road, so roadside bomb, the most roadside bombs of any road in Iraq, with 7 to 10 roadside bombs on it a day. So we started putting in these combat outposts represented by those small blue circles, and as we put in these combat outposts, we started to pacify the areas around them. And we did this by going out into the neighborhoods. Once we had those combat outposts established, going out into the neighborhoods and interacting with the local friendly Iraqi populace, which is what Ramadi was made up of. It was a war zone, but there was normal Iraqi citizens that lived there, and they did not want those insurgents bearing down on them and terrorizing them every day. So once we connected with the local populace and built some relationships with them, they started giving us intelligence as to where the bad guys were. And the transition was very incredible to see. And we got to a point where we kind of had the enemy cornered, and we had that one last area of enemy-controlled territory in the center. And so we decided we'd put one more combat outpost in there. And when we did that, I thought to myself, well, they're cornered, and so this is going to be a very tough fight. And I was shocked that when we went in to put in this last combat outpost, not a shot was fired, because all the enemy was either dead or they had fled the city. And that right there was our first real indication of this radical transformation that was about to take place in the city of Ramadi. And we didn't get to see it with our own eyes, because shortly after that operation, that last operation, we headed back to America. We were done with our deployment. And when we got home, of course, we paid attention to what was going on in Ramadi. And we heard the enemy attacks. When we were there was 30 to 50 enemy attacks a day. And we heard those enemy attacks drop to 20 a day, and then 5 a day, and then 1 a day, and then 1 a week. And as we heard about this happening, it was hard to believe it. It was hard to believe the transition that was taking place in Ramadi. But eventually, the SEALs that replaced us in Ramadi sent us back pictures of what Ramadi was like for them. So here on the left-hand side, you see those pictures are what Ramadi was like for me. It was a total war zone. Vehicles blown up in the streets, buildings rubbled out, and we got sent these pictures on the right. The bottom picture, I'm sorry, the picture's a little small, but the bottom picture is a U.S. Marine and an Iraqi policeman, and they're out in the streets with a couple kids playing soccer. When we were there, the kids wouldn't even go into the streets, and here they were playing soccer. The middle picture on the right-hand side, that's a picture of a girls' school. And if you know anything about the tenets of Al-Qaeda's brand of Islam, they're not exactly pro-women's education. As a matter of fact, they don't even think that women should know how to read. But the citizens of Ramadi did not want that. They wanted their daughters to be educated. They wanted their daughters to have a better life. So coalition forces helped them build a school. And there it was, a bunch of young Iraqi girls going to school. And then the final picture on the top, on the right-hand side there, again, I apologize, it's a little bit hard to make out, but it kind of looks like a road race. It's a road race. It's a road race that the citizens of Ramadi organized and they ran it right down Route Michigan. And when I saw that picture, I knew that despite everyone that said that this was an unwinnable situation, despite everyone that said this was a quagmire, this was another Vietnam, or there was no way that we could achieve victory, when I saw that picture, I knew that they were wrong and that victory had absolutely been achieved in the city of Ramadi. And for every victory, there's a cost. And the cost that was paid in the Battle of Ramadi for victory was immense. And while we were there with the 11 AD, the 11 AD lost 9 of those Abrams main battle tanks. They lost 15 Bradley fighting vehicles, which is like a smaller tank. They lost 34 Humvees. They had almost 500 wounded in action. And they had 61 killed in action. And of those 61 that were killed in action, from my SEAL Task Unit BRUISER, we lost Mark Lee, who was the first SEAL killed in Iraq. We lost Mikey Mansour, who was the second SEAL killed in Iraq, who was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor after he jumped on a grenade to save 3 of our other teammates. And finally, Ryan Jobe, who was shot in the face, was gravely wounded, was rendered blind by the damage that was done, but who made it back to America, was medically retired from the Navy, and who, after his 22nd surgery to repair the damage that was done to his face and to his head. There were complications. And Ryan died as well. So what do you bring home from a deployment like that? Well, one thing that you bring home from a deployment like that is you bring home a burden. Especially from a leadership perspective, because when you're flying home to San Diego and you know you're going to see your family again, and you know you're going to see your friends again, and you know you're just going to go ahead and carry on with the rest of your life. And at the same time, you also know that you didn't bring home all your men. And that's something you're going to have to live with. And that's something that's never going to go away. But at the same time, you have to bring home something positive. You have to bring home something good. And for me, the best thing that I brought home from the Battle of Ramadi was the lessons that we learned. We learned about humility. We learned about ownership. We learned about teamwork. And we learned about leadership. And when I talk about leadership, I'm not just talking about me because I was in charge of the task unit. I'm not just talking about the brigade commander who was in charge of the brigade. I'm talking about every level of leadership, right down to the frontline SEAL that's not even in charge of any other people, but takes ownership of his part of the mission and executes. And we learned without a shred of doubt that leadership is the most important thing on the battlefield. Now, when I came home from this deployment, I took over the training for the West Coast SEAL teams. Not the training where guys carry boats on their heads and carry logs around and do a bunch of push-ups. The training that I took over was the tactical training. The training where SEALs learn to shoot, move, and communicate. The training where SEALs learn combat leadership. And when I took over this training, the very first training operation I went on with a SEAL platoon was an unmitigated disaster. They completely failed. And I knew that they failed because their leadership did not know how to lead. And I went back to my barracks that night, and I realized that I had to take the lessons that I had learned, and I had to distill them down into something that these young SEAL leaders could understand and implement into their platoons. And I wrote down what I ended up calling the 4 laws of combat. Cover and move, simple, prioritize and execute, and decentralized command. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these. Cover and move. Cover and move is a gunfighting tactic. That's what it is. It's a gunfighting tactic. And when I first started working with companies, I didn't even know if I was going to talk about this, because this is how you win machine gun fights. And I don't work with a lot of companies that do machine gun fighting. I know sometimes it feels like it. What's your name? Brian? Okay, so let me explain cover and move to you. Brian and I are going to attack a building over there. There's bad guys in it. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to start shooting at the bad guys. Now, who knows what the bad guys are doing when I'm shooting at them? No, they are not shooting back. You've never been shot at before. When you're getting shot at, you want to know what you do? You go, ah! That's what you do. So while I'm shooting at the bad guys, Brian's going to get up and he's going to move to a better position. Once Brian's in a better position, he's going to start shooting at the bad guys. While he's shooting at the bad guys, I'm going to get up and move to a better position. Once I'm there, I'm going to start shooting at the bad guys. And then Brian's going to move to a better position. And we're going to do that. We're going to continue to work together as a team until we get close enough to the building to take out the bad guys and take it down. So that's cover and move. Very simple. It's teamwork. It's us working together. Now, what happens if Brian is up and moving and I'm supposed to be shooting, but I decide I'm really kind of thirsty right now, so I put my gun down and open up my canteen and get a drink? Now what do the bad guys do? Yeah, now they start shooting. And Brian gets killed. And that's really bad for Brian. Sorry, dude. But guess what? It's about to be equally as bad for me. Because once they kill Brian, you know what they're going to do to me? They're going to cover and move on me. They're going to do the same thing. So when one part of the team doesn't execute their part, it's not just one part of the team that fails. The whole team fails. If we don't work together as a team, everyone fails. Now, a lot of what this boils down to is relationships. And I know no one expects the big Navy SEAL to come in here and talk to everyone about relationships, right? But if you want cover and move to work, you have to build relationships, not just inside your own team, but with the other teams that you work with. Those tanks that I talked about that came and rescued my guys over and over again, they risked their lives to rescue my guys. They didn't work for me. Our chain of command was totally separate. They're in the Army, I'm in the Navy. They're in conventional forces, I'm in special operations. And yet they would risk their lives to go help my guys. Why is that? It's because we developed relationships with them. We developed relationships throughout the chain of command so that we understood what each other's needs were, we supported each other, and we covered and moved for each other all the time. And that is what you have to do inside and outside of your organization. Cover and move. Next up, we got simple. And I used to get these young SEAL leaders, and they think they were so smart with their giant brains. And they'd come up with a plan for a training operation. It would be the most complex, convoluted plan that you've ever seen. And they'd present it to me like it was a brilliant plan. And I would look at the plan, and then I'd whisper to them, "You're an idiot." I would say, "This is crazy. The best plan and the most brilliant plan is the plan that's so simple and so clear that every single person on the team understands the plan so that they can execute it. So you got to keep your plan simple." And then I get these young SEAL leaders that say, "Well, my guys aren't listening to me. They're not doing what I'm telling them to do." And I'd say, "Well, what do you think could possibly be wrong with them?" And they'd say, "Well, I don't know." And I'd say, "Well, do you think that they're deaf?" "No." "Do you think they don't care?" "No." "So what do you think their problem is?" "Oh, no." And I'd say, "Well, that's because it's not their problem, it's your problem." And when your team is not doing what you want them to do, the first person you should look at is yourself and make sure that you are giving them their instructions and their direction in simple, clear, concise manner that they understand. Because if the team doesn't understand what you want them to do, then there is no possible way they can execute it. So you have to keep it simple. And next we get prioritize and execute. You're going to have bad things happen on the battlefield. It's going to happen, and guess what? Multiple bad things are going to happen, and they're all going to happen at the same time. Same thing in business, same thing in life. And when I was running that training, I wanted that training to mimic the chaos of combat, and I went through great lengths to do that. We used paintball guns and high-speed laser tag guns, and we brought in set designers to make the places look like they were Iraq or Afghanistan. We hired actors and actresses and special effects people, and so this is what would happen. A SEAL platoon would go into a building to clear it, and there'd be a big explosion, and they'd get hit in the face with pieces of foam, and then they'd hear screaming, and they'd look down on the ground, and on the ground there'd be a guy with no leg, and there'd be blood spraying everywhere. And that would be an amputee actor and fake blood, like Friday the 13th. And then as they're starting to see this and in shock from that, all of a sudden a door would open up and out would walk 3 middle-aged Arabic women asking for help. And then I'd start shooting everyone with paintballs and then start making more things blow up. So I would just create this total chaos. And I'd watch these young SEAL leaders, and I'd watch what they would do. And they'd see the wounded guy, and so they'd start working on the wounded guy, and then they'd go over and figure out what to do with these middle-aged Arabic women, and then they're trying to figure out where all their people are, and then they go and figure out where they're trying to get shot at from. And as they try and solve all these problems at the same time, you know how many problems they would actually solve? None. And so I'd say, listen, this is what you have to do. You have to prioritize and execute. You've got to pick the biggest problem and focus your efforts and your resources on that biggest problem until you get that one taken care of. Then you can move on to the next one. And when you get done with that one, you can move on to the next biggest one. And so when I would tell them that, and they'd have these problems, they'd have the wounded guy, they'd have the firefight, they'd have the civilians to deal with, they'd try and figure out where all their people are. What do you think they would focus on? What do you think they'd pick as their biggest priority? Take a guess. What? Firefight is the correct answer. What do you think they'd focus on, though? The wounded guy. Yes, we all know it. We all know it. Why would they focus on the wounded guy? They would focus on the wounded guy because that's Brian. That's my brother Brian, and he's shot. And when I see that Brian's shot and he's screaming at the top of his lungs, I'm going to walk over to Brian because I want to help him. And then what's going to happen to me? I'm going to get shot. So what I had to teach these young SEAL leaders to do, I had to teach them to detach. to detach from the chaos and detach from the mayhem and detach from their emotions. Because when I go and try and handle the wounded guy because I know him, that's an emotional decision. And we do not make good decisions when we're emotional. Because the biggest problem, as you all pointed out, is the people with machine guns that are trying to kill us. So what you have to learn to do is to detach and assess what is actually happening and then prioritize and execute. And finally, we get decentralized command. Now, decentralized command is a big word. And I heard about it a lot when I was in the military. I heard a lot about it in the civilian sector. A lot of people talk about it, but very few organizations actually execute this well. And it's not really that hard to execute. What it really means, what decentralized command really means, is everybody leads. Everybody leads. And that is what you want as a leader. You want everyone on your team to step up and lead. Now, running this training, I tell guys, okay, hey, platoon leader, you know that training exercise I put you out on last night that was all crazy and chaotic? And they'd say, yeah. And I'd say, it's going to be even worse tonight. It's going to be more complex, more crazy. You need to use decentralized command. You need to let your subordinate leaders lead. And they'd say, okay. And then I'd send them out on the training operation. And I'd watch, and all of a sudden we'd start hitting them with all that chaos. And once the chaos hit, I would watch the subordinate leaders. And I would see the subordinate leaders start to step up, and they'd start to lead, but they'd start to lead in opposite directions. Or they would lead on top of each other. They'd all be shouting different orders. Sometimes they'd even shoot at each other. And it'd be a total disaster. And everyone would die with paintball. And we'd bring them back to base, and I'd say, okay, that was pathetic. What went wrong? And then the leader would stand up and say, well, I tried using that decentralized command stuff, but it just doesn't work. And I'd say, actually, decentralized command works great. It's just that you suck at it. And then, of course, I'd realize that I'm the one that's supposed to be teaching them decentralized command. So I'm the one that sucks. And I'd say, okay, listen, here's what's going on. In order for decentralized command to work, you still have to lead. And the way that you lead with decentralized command is you have to make sure that everyone understands what the goal is. You have to make sure they understand what the mission is, what the end state is. You have to make sure that they understand what the parameters are that they're allowed to work in, how far they can go to the left, how far they can go to the right, how far forward, how far back. And then the most important thing that they need to understand is why they're doing what they're doing. In the military, we call that commander's intent. What is it that I, as the overall leader, what is it that I intend to have happen? Why are we doing this? That's what the teams need to understand. So, for example, Brian and I are going out on a mission. And I say, okay, Brian, here's what's happening. We're going to take down this building tonight. Once we get the building taken down and the target secure, I want you to take your team up to the rooftop and set security. And Brian says, cool, got it. And so we go on the mission. We take down the building. We get the target secure. Brian takes his team up to the rooftop to set security. Now, most of the roofs in Iraq are flat because it doesn't rain very much. And then up on the roof, they have a roof wall. It's called a parapet wall that goes around. It's like 4 or 5 feet tall. It's pretty tall. And it's made of concrete like the rest of the building. And so it makes being on a rooftop a great place to be because you're in an elevated position, but the enemy can't see you. And if the enemy does see you, they can't shoot at you because there's a concrete wall there. For whatever reason, Brian gets his team up to the rooftop. There's no roof wall. And so his guys are exposed to the enemy. And his guys feel that. And when you're exposed to the enemy, believe me, you actually feel it. So they're thinking they're going to get shot. The enemy can see them. The enemy can shoot at them. So they're looking at Brian thinking, hey, Brian, we're exposed up here. What do you think? And Brian's like, hey, lay down more. And now they're looking at him thinking, okay, what are they thinking of Brian right now? They think he's an idiot. Yes, thank you. And so Brian doesn't want to feel like an idiot, So they say, hey, Brian, we're exposed. The enemy can see us. The enemy can shoot at us. Why are we up here? And Brian says, well, we're up here because Jocko told us to be up here. And now what do they think of me? They think I'm an idiot too. And so now what you have is a team on the rooftop who's exposed to enemy fire, and they, on top of that, think that their entire chain of command is a bunch of idiots. So this is a horrible situation to be in. How do we fix it? We go back to the planning phase. And I say, okay, Brian, here's what's going on. We're going to take down this building tonight. Once we get the target secure, I want you to take your team up to the rooftop and set security. Cool? And Brian says, cool, got it. And then I say, here's why I want you to do this. I want you to do this to make sure no enemy attacks us on this road up here to the north. And Brian says, cool, got it. And now we go on the mission, we take down the building, we get the target secure. Brian takes his team up to the rooftop to set security like he was supposed to do. He gets up there and he sees that there's no roof wall. He knows that his men are exposed. So he looks around and he says, okay guys, come with me. They go back down the stairs to the 3rd floor. They go into a north-facing room. They open up the windows. He puts his machine gunners in place. He calls me up on the radio and says, hey, Jocko, it's Brian. There was no roof wall on the roof. The guys were exposed, so we're in the 3rd floor in a north-facing room, and we got the road covered. And you know what I say? I say, thank you, because he was able to solve that problem. He was able to solve that problem because he understood the commander's intent. He understood why he was doing what he was doing. Now, if Brian goes into the field without knowing why he's doing what he's doing, whose fault is that? Whose fault is it? Mine, because I'm the commander, right? For sure. I'll own that. But guess what? If Brian doesn't know why he's doing what he's doing, it's his responsibility to raise his hand and say, hey, boss, why are we doing this? Now, some bosses get offended when I say that, because the last thing they want is their subordinate to stand there and say, hey, boss, why are we doing this? They say, shut up and do what I told you to do. That is not what we want. That is not what we want. When one of our team members actually wants to know why we're doing what we're doing, you as a leader should be overjoyed that they are asking that question, so that they understand why, so that they get out there and they can make decisions and they can lead based on the intent that you have put into their head and that they understand. And if you do that, your organization will be able to operate faster, with better response, and more on board with the strategy that you are running, because you are using decentralized command. Now, those were the 4 laws of combat, and they're pretty straightforward. They're not always simple to implement, but they're pretty straightforward to understand. This one's a little bit different. This idea is called the Dichotomy of Leadership. And what this is, these are opposing forces that are pulling you as a leader in opposite directions. And what's really hard about this is both directions that you're getting pulled as a leader are correct. So what do I mean by that? Decentralized command, which is letting your subordinate leaders lead. But I also wrote a book called Extreme Ownership, which means own everything. So which one is it? You want me to own everything? You want me to let my subordinate leaders lead? And the answer is you have to balance these two. And that's the answer to all these dichotomies. You have to balance these opposing forces. You got to be a leader, of course, but you also need to know when to be a follower. If Brian works for me, but he comes up with a better plan than me, I don't say shut up and do it my way. No, actually, instead I say, you know what? Brian, that's a better plan than I had. Why don't you take lead and I'll follow? There's nothing wrong with that. You got to be calm, but you can't be robotic. You got to be courageous, but at the same time, you have to be cautious. You got to be competitive, but at the same time, you got to be a gracious loser. You got to be humble, but you got to be confident. And then we get my personal favorite, which is discipline and freedom. So on the one side, you've got discipline, which is a rigid, structured way of doing things. And then on the other side, you got freedom, which is we do whatever we want. And what does everyone want out of those two? What does everyone want? Yeah, of course, everyone wants freedom. Everyone wants freedom. What's interesting about this dichotomy is that everyone wants freedom, but if you want freedom, the only way to get there is through discipline. That's how you get there. And the two easy examples I can give you are, number one, everyone wants financial freedom. Of course. How do you get financial freedom? You have to have financial discipline. You have to save your money. You have to work hard, have the discipline to work hard to earn money. You got to have the discipline to invest your money. You got to have the discipline not to buy stupid things that you don't even need. And if you have that kind of financial discipline, you'll end up with financial freedom. Same thing with free time. Everyone wants free time. How do you get more free time? You get more free time by having more disciplined time management, by having the discipline to make a schedule, by having the discipline to stick to the schedule, by having the discipline to wake up earlier in the morning. You got to have the discipline to say no to things that don't benefit you in any way. Like clicking on the next YouTube video. You've already watched 18 videos of a cat. You don't need to watch 19. You need to impose your discipline on YouTube and say no. And if you can put that kind of discipline on your time, you'll end up with more free time. But this isn't only true with you as an individual. It's true with teams too. It's true with organizations. And if you saw my SEAL task unit or you saw my SEAL platoon, you'd see that we had disciplined standard operating procedures for just about everything that we did. For the way that we loaded our vehicles, the way we lined up our vehicles, the way we dismounted our vehicles, the way we approached buildings, the way we entered buildings, just about everything that we did, we had a standard operating procedure for. Highly disciplined. And you might think to yourself that those standard operating procedures constricted us out on the battlefield. But the opposite is actually true. Because we had these disciplined standard operating procedures, it gave us freedom, because if I wanted Brian to go take down a building that we hadn't planned to take down, all I needed to say is, hey, Brian, go take down that building over there. And he could do it. He didn't need to tell me who he was going to take or what weapons they were going to use or what methodology they were going to use to take down the building. We already knew that. And his team already knew it too. So if you have discipline inside your organization, it actually gives you more freedom. Now, can you take this too far? The answer is yes. And I see military organizations that take it too far, and I see civilian companies that take it too far. They impose so much discipline and so much process on their people that it does start to constrain them. And the most important thing that it constrains is their brains. And you end up with teams that are only waiting to follow a procedure, even in situations where a procedure might not fit. So even with discipline and freedom, you have to balance this dichotomy to maximize your capabilities as a team. Now, I used to get these young SEAL leaders, and there'd be a problem in a building or something. And they'd hear gunfire, paintball fire going off in there, and they'd kind of walk up and look inside and then maybe back away from it. And I'd walk up behind him and I'd give him a nice little gentle push in the back. And I'd tell him, you got to get in there. That problem inside that building is not going to go away. That's not going to happen. You got to get aggressive. That's got to be your default mode. You have to go in there and solve that problem. So if I think the enemy's going to take some high ground over there, I'm going to take it first. If I think the enemy's going to maneuver over there, I'm going to get there first. If I have a problem with a client, or I made a mistake with a client, I'm not going to hide and wait till that thing explodes. No, I'm going to make that phone call. I'm going to aggressively attack those problems. And I have to say this. When I talk about being aggressive, I'm not talking about being aggressive towards your people. Okay? I'm not talking about, Brian, you better do what I told you to do right now. I'm not talking about that. That doesn't build our relationship. I'm talking about being aggressive towards your mission. I'm talking about being aggressive towards solving problems. And I'm talking about being aggressive towards your goals. That's got to be your default mode. Now, another thing that I get asked all the time is, what's the most important characteristic for a leader? And this is a pretty easy answer for me. The most important characteristic for a leader to have is humility. And the reason that I know that is because when we would fire SEAL leaders, when I was running that training, we would fire SEAL leaders. And these guys would be guys with 5, 8 years sometimes in the SEAL teams. And we would not be firing them because they didn't know how to shoot their gun. We wouldn't be firing them because they didn't know how to read a map. We wouldn't be firing them because they didn't know how to work their radio. We would be firing them because they lacked humility. Because when you lack humility, think about what it does to your mindset. When you lack humility, first of all, you don't listen to anyone else. Because why would you? You already know. You already know everything. So why would I listen to anyone else? I'm definitely not going to listen to my new guys. I'm not going to listen to my subordinates. Why would I listen to them? I'm not even going to listen to my peers because I'm doing it better than they are. In fact, I don't even listen to my boss anymore. Because you know what? Oh, the boss is up in that ivory tower. He doesn't know what it's like down here in the field. So I'm not going to listen to him. And that all stems from a lack of humility. The other thing that happens when we lack humility is we don't respect the enemy. In the business world, what does that mean? It means you don't respect your competitors. And when you don't respect your competitors, I'm not talking about you got to be afraid of them, but you have to respect them. Because if you don't respect the enemy, if you don't respect your competitors, that's when you stop preparing. That's when you start cutting corners. And when you don't prepare and you cut corners, that is absolutely when you get caught. And that right there stems from a lack of humility. The other thing that happens, and probably the worst thing that happens if you lack humility, when you look in the mirror, you can't even do a good, solid assessment of yourself and see areas where you're weak, areas where you could improve. And when you start looking in the mirror and seeing the greatest leader of all time, that's when you start going backwards. You should constantly be looking for your weaknesses and how you can improve upon those weaknesses. The minute you stop doing that is the minute the rest of the world who is doing that will pass you by. So you have to stay humble. And finally, we get to this idea of extreme ownership. And this idea of extreme ownership, this is the title of the first book that I wrote. Why did we name the title of the first book Extreme Ownership? Because when we saw military teams and military leaders and civilian teams and civilian leaders that were successful, this was the attitude that we saw they had. This attitude of extreme ownership, not blaming any other person or not blaming anything on failure, but taking ownership of those problems themselves. And this was very easy for me to see when I was running that SEAL training. When I was running that SEAL training, it was easy to see because I got to see the stark contrast between a good SEAL leader and a bad SEAL leader. Because I put through platoons all the time. And some had good SEAL leaders, some had medium SEAL leaders, and some had bad SEAL leaders. And this concept was so obvious when you saw a good SEAL leader versus a bad SEAL leader. It looked like this. You take a bad SEAL leader. I'd have a bad SEAL leader coming through my training. And we'd send him out on one of these crazy training operations. And it would be a complete failure. Everything would be a disaster. Everyone would be covered with paintball. Unmitigated train wreck. And I'd bring them back to base and I'd say, okay, that was absolutely horrible and pathetic and embarrassing. What went wrong? And if we had a bad SEAL leader, the bad SEAL leader would stand up and say, I'll tell you what went wrong, okay? First of all, the assault team leader, he didn't bring enough people. He didn't bring enough people to take down that target. He didn't do a good target analysis. He should have brought more people. That's pathetic. And then the mobility commander here in charge of the Humvees, in charge of picking us up, you didn't even know where to come pick us up. That's the only piece of information that you needed, and you didn't have it. That's embarrassing. And then the assault team over here, it took you all forever to get through that target. You were moving like molasses. You're all jacked up. In fact, whoever trained you is all jacked up. So if we're going to do any better, they need to fix themselves. He needs to figure out how to do his job, and he needs to get a grip on reality. And of course, I'd be sitting there listening to this. Anybody notice anything peculiar about this debrief? Yeah. None of it was my fault. No. None of it was my fault. It was his fault, it was his fault, and it was their fault. And when I point my finger at you or anyone in this room, when I point my finger at you and I start blaming you for something going wrong, what's your reaction? Yes, you get defensive. That's exactly what happens. Happens to anyone. Anyone, you get a finger pointed at you and you start get defensive. And that's what happens here on this team. What we get is everyone pointing their fingers at each other. We have no one taking ownership of the problems at all. And when no one takes ownership of the problems don't get solved. And that team is never going to perform. Now, you take a good SEAL leader. A good SEAL leader, you send them out on the same training operation. It's just as hard, and they do just as bad. It's a total disaster. And I bring them back to base, and I bring them into the debriefing room. And I say to the boss, okay, boss, you know what went wrong? That was pathetic. And a good SEAL leader stands up and he says, okay, first of all, let me tell you what I saw from my perspective. The assault team leader here, I didn't give you the assets that you needed for that mission. I should have sat down with you and gone through the target and made sure that you knew how many people you were going to need. So that's my fault. Next time I'll get with you and make sure we have that number figured out. The mobility commander here, you didn't know where to come pick us up with the Humvees. That's actually the only piece of information that you needed for this operation, and somehow you came to my brief that I'm responsible for, and I failed as a leader to give you the only piece of information that you needed. Not only did you not know, no one on your team knew. And that is my fault, and I guarantee it will never happen again. We will get face to face to make sure you know where you're picking us up. And then the assault team over here, took you guys a long time to clear through that target. A real long time. And I think what happened was, I know I gave you time to do rehearsals, but I didn't actually go out and do any of the rehearsals with you. So next time, I'm going to make sure I go out, do some of the walkthroughs, do some of the rehearsals, and make sure that you understand the complexities of the target and how you're going to handle those complexities. Those are the things that I'm going to do different so we do better next time. Now, this is totally different debrief. And now let me ask you this, does the team now point their fingers at me and say, you're damn right, Jocko, this was all your fault? Do they do that? No, they don't do that. They don't do that. As a matter of fact, what happens is the assault team leader says, hey boss, I'm in charge of the assault. I'm in charge of taking down the building. I didn't bring enough people. That's not your fault. It's my fault. I rounded down the number of people I thought I was going to need. I'll never make that mistake again. You don't need to hold my hand. And then the mobility commander says, boss, I only needed one piece of information for this mission and I didn't have it. That is my failure, not yours. And I guarantee you, I will never let that happen again. And then the assault team says, boss, you know what, boss? We were too slow. And you know what? You gave us enough time to do about 20 rehearsals. And we did 3. You don't need to babysit us. We will rehearse and we will be ready for the next mission. And now you can see what we have is a team where everyone on the team is taking ownership of the problems. And when everyone on the team takes ownership of the problems get solved. And by the way, this doesn't only go down the chain of command, it goes up the chain of command too. I hear this all the time. I heard it in the military. I hear it in the civilian sector. Why'd you fail the mission? Well, my boss didn't give me what I needed. Not my fault. Boss didn't give me what I needed. Didn't get the support. Didn't get the people. Didn't get the training. Didn't get the money. Not my fault. Wrong answer. Wrong answer. If your boss isn't giving you the training that you need or the resources that you need or the people that you need, that's not your boss's fault. That's actually your fault. Because Your boss is aligned with what you want to achieve. My boss wants me to go out, kill bad guys, and win the war. I want to go out, kill bad guys, and win the war. Now, if I go to my boss and explain to him that I've got a plan or need something that's going to help us kill bad guys and win the war, he's going to give it to me. If he doesn't give it to me, it means I didn't explain it right. It means I didn't educate him. I didn't influence him properly. But if I'm going to use something from him that's going to help us win, he's going to give it to me. Now, there is a caveat to that. Are you always going to get what you want? No. Why not? Because there's no organization in the world that has unlimited resources. And we'd see this in the military. It's like, oh, my guys come to me and say, hey, Jocko, we're going on a mission tonight. We want a helicopter to cover our movement to the target. Can you get us one? And I'd say, yeah, of course. Go up the chain of command. Hey, boss, need a helicopter to cover my guys' movement to the target. The boss says, no. And I go, okay. And I say, hey, guys, you know that helicopter you wanted? And they say, yeah. And I go, you're not having it. And they go, okay. What are they thinking? They're thinking the boss doesn't get it. They're thinking they don't get the support. They're thinking I'm an idiot. The boss is an idiot. How do we solve this problem? It goes back to the question why. When my boss tells me that, you know what I said to my boss? Hey, boss, why not? And my boss says, oh, well, I've got 2 other platoons that are going further away from base to a worse area, and I'm going to give them the 1 aircraft that we have tonight. And I say, okay, boss, that makes sense. And I say, hey, platoon, there's 2 other platoons going further away from base to a worse area. We only have 1 aircraft, and they're getting it. Does the platoon now say, well, screw the other platoons? No, they actually say, okay, you know what? Makes sense. We'll figure out another way to mitigate risk. So that's what we end up with. We end up in a situation and on a team where everyone is taking ownership up and down the chain of command. And when you have that in an organization, the organization becomes unstoppable. Now, I also have to say this. I'll get done speaking to a company. And when I get done speaking to the company, somebody will come up to me and they'll say, hey, man, I really liked what you said about ownership. If my team would just take ownership, we'd be good to go. And then I'll get someone else that'll come up to me and say, hey, I really liked what you said about ownership. And I hope my boss was paying attention because if he would just take ownership, we'd be good to go. I'm not talking about your boss. I'm not talking about your team. I'm actually talking about you. And what you'll find is that if you start taking ownership of what's going on in your world, other people inside your organization will also start to take ownership. And the people that don't start taking ownership will get steamrolled by the team that does. And you will end up winning. Now, I want to close this out talking about the last mission that we did in RAMADI. We were 24 to 48 hours from going home. We actually had most of our gear on these big aircraft pallets. Everyone had 1 bag left over with their weapon and their radio and their body armor in it in case a mission came up. But we were pretty much ready to go home. And I'm sitting in my office doing some administrative work in the Tactical Operations Center, and a guy comes and knocks on my door. And it's one of the platoon commanders says, hey, boss, this bad guy we've been looking for the last 6 months, we know where he's going to be tonight. And we want to go get him. And I said, hey, that sounds like a good idea to me. What'd the guy do? He says he's killed a bunch of innocent Iraqi civilians and he's killed a bunch of Americans. And I said, roger that. Go start coming up with a plan. So platoon commander leaves, goes back with his platoon. They start coming up with a plan on how to assault this target. I start running it up the chain of command, getting the various approvals that we need, deconflicting with other friendly units. And I'm sitting there for a couple hours doing this, and I get another knock on the door. And another guy comes into my office. And this guy is another SEAL, but he had broken service, which meant he was out of the military for about a dozen years, and after September 11th, he came back in. But he was an older guy. He had a lot of experience in the world. I had a lot of respect for him, and I was like, hey, what's going on, man? And he shut the door behind him, so I knew he had something serious to talk to me about. And I said, what's up? And he said, you know, I've been out in the platoon space talking to some of the guys in the platoon, and we're thinking that maybe we don't need to do this mission. He said, we've been here for over 6 months. We've conducted hundreds of operations. We've had a huge impact on the battlefield, but we've also taken some significant casualties. And we lost Mark, and we lost Mikey, and we don't know what's going to happen to Ryan, but we know it's not good, and we're thinking that maybe we should just go home. And I had to think about that, because that was a legitimate point. And if we rolled out on that operation that night and hit a big roadside bomb or got into a big firefight, we could lose 2 more guys, or 4 more guys, or 6 more guys that night. And as I thought about that, I looked up at him and I said, let me ask you a question. If we don't do this operation, who's going to do it? Are we going to turn it over to the next SEAL team that shows up here? That's not acclimated to the weather, that doesn't know the terrain like we know it? Are we going to let them take the risk? Or are we going to turn it over to one of the conventional forces that doesn't have the training that we have, that doesn't have the gear that we have? Are we going to turn it over to them and let them take the risk? Or are we just going to let this guy go? We only know where he's going to be for one night. He's killed a bunch of innocent Iraqi civilians, and he's killed a bunch of Americans. If we don't do this operation, who's going to do it? And he didn't even answer the question. He didn't even answer the question because he knew what the answer was, and I knew what the answer was. If we did not do this mission, no one was going to do it. And the guys went out that night and caught the bad guy and came back to base. And the next day we went home. But that conversation stuck with me, especially from a leadership perspective. Because when you're in a leadership perspective, you're the one that has to step up. When you're in a leadership position, you're the one that has to build relationships so you can cover and move. You're the one that has to simplify things so that everyone on the team understands it. You're the one that has to figure out what the priorities are so you can execute on them. When you're a leader, you're the one that has to establish a culture of decentralized command so everyone understands the commander's intent and knows why they're doing what they're doing. And most important, when you are a leader, you are the one that has to take ownership because no one else is. So I say what you do is you take ownership. Take extreme ownership. Take ownership of your mission. Take ownership of your job. Take ownership of your clients. Take ownership of your future. And take ownership of your life. And then lead. That's what you have to do. That is the most powerful tool we have as human beings, is to lead. You step up and lead yourself and your team to victory. And that is all I have. And before I go, I wanted to say thank you all for bringing me here. But more important, I talked a lot about what the military does and the strength and the power of the military. But there is no force stronger in the world than economic power and economic force. And what you all are doing in this room with technology to expand the economy, to bring the economy across the globe together, that right there, what you do every day, is the most powerful force in the world for making the world a more peaceful and a better place. So thank you all for what you're doing, and thank you all for having me here. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Sooner or later, gotta cut you down.